Welcome you all. It's just 7 o'clock now, and I'm sure more people will be joining us. We're just delighted that you've come tonight. This is the very first time we've ever done a letter writing workshop over Zoom. So you're part of a noble and grand experiment in making a difference by acting together and using the technology we have available to us. And looking forward to the times we'll be able to be together in person. But tonight we're having our party on Zoom. So this workshop is being brought to you by Climatefast members. My name is Lyn Adamson. I'm co-chair. And I'd like to start first by acknowledging that the land on which we are gathering tonight is the traditional, if you're in Toronto, it's in the traditional territory of the Wendat, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Seneca, and the Mississauga of the Credit Nations. This territory is covered with the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, an agreement between Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and allied nations to peaceably care for and share the land and the resources around the Great Lakes. All of us who live and work in Toronto are treaty people. So we invite everyone to think about our responsibilities to this land and water and to the peoples who have cared for this place for thousands of years. And I'd like to just give you a brief introduction to Climatefast and then hand things over to our facilitator for tonight. So a little bit about Climatefast. We began in 2012 with a fast on Parliament Hill, and we called on members of Parliament to sign a pledge to work, to do whatever they could, this was during the Harper years, to work for a price on carbon, an end to fossil fuel subsidies, and a renewable energy plan for Canada. And over 3 years, 130 MPs and 14 senators signed this pledge. Now, as you may know, there is currently a price on carbon, and it is now set to rise to $170 per ton by 2030 as part of the just released climate plan for Canada. This is a credit to the organizing work of Citizens Climate Lobby and other groups, including ours, and shows what citizen action can do. Since 2015, Climatefast has been working toward an effective and well-funded climate plan for Toronto called Transform TO. We also have initiatives at the provincial level where we presented petitions for a real climate plan for Ontario. We work with Climate Strike Youth to support public demonstrations for climate action, and we've developed a program to bring kitchen table climate conversations to communities around the province. It's really important that we engage new people in this movement, and we welcome involvement tonight and in any of these initiatives going forward as well. We need our recovery, our climate movement, to be just and inclusive. So we support the call for the just and green recovery, and ourselves have an anti-racism committee in our group. We've organized many webcasts, which are all posted on our YouTube channel, Climatefast Action. But our focus tonight is on the Climate Accountability Act and the changes we'll be able to make by working together. Thanks again so much for coming, and I'd now like to hand things over to Dr. Ann Keary. Over to you, Ann.
Thank you so much, Lyn, and welcome everybody again to our Fight for 1.5 and a 2025 Climate Target letter writing party. So I'm going to share my screen. And I have a short presentation. Oh, sorry. I think I just... Did that share?
Yes, you can see it.
Okay. Okay, very good. And I will just go here. Okay, so I'm going to organize this presentation around 3 questions. Why do we need a strong Climate Accountability Act? What should it include? The 5 pillars or best practices that we can draw from other examples of climate accountability legislation elsewhere. And then how does this new Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act measure up, and how can it be improved? What amendments should we be pushing for? So why do we need a strong Climate Accountability Act? Well, the first and most obvious answer to that question is we are in a climate emergency. We have to act now. We have to act as soon as possible if we are to have a chance at limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. As I'm guessing most of you on this call will know, In 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned world leaders that we have to at least reduce emissions by 45% by 2030 and get to net zero by 2050 if we are to have a chance at limiting warming to 1.5 Celsius. As you may also know, right now, the Fridays for Future Youth have launched a campaign, Fight for 1.5, and 1.5 is what we're fighting for. So I'm now going to hand over briefly to Ray and a video from Katharine Hayhoe on why fighting for 1.5 is so important. Katharine Hayhoe, as you may know, is a climate scientist. She's currently based in Texas, but actually she's Canadian. She's originally from Etobicoke, and she's a wonderful climate communicator. So Ray, if you can show us this clip from the video, that would be great.
The difference between a warming of 1 or 2 or 3 degrees or more is laid out in detail in a few key resources. First, there's a report by the National Academy of Sciences called Climate Stabilization Targets. In this report, which I co-authored along with other scientists, we found that per degree of warming, we expect a 3 to 10% increase in the amount of rain falling in the heaviest events, a 5 to 15% reduction in the yields of major crops, and a 200 to 400% increase in the area burned by wildfire across the western US. And as we talk about in our Global Weirding episode on climate impacts in the Southwest, the area burned by wildfires today has already almost doubled since the 1980s due to a changing climate. Then there's the 2018 IPCC report that looks at the difference between a 1.5 and a 2 degree world. It highlights not only the risks that increase with temperature, but also which ones we'd see a significant difference in, even between 1.5 and 2 degrees. These include average and extreme temperatures, sea level rise, extreme rainfall, and drought risk for some regions. It's estimated that biodiversity loss could double under an additional ½ degree of warming, and there would be increased risk of permafrost thaw in the Arctic, as well as ocean acidification around the world. In terms of human impacts, if warming can be limited to 1.5 instead of 2 degrees, this could mean 50% fewer people exposed to water stress and lower risks to health, food security, and economic growth. That's a huge difference we're talking about for just ½ degree Celsius or 0.9 degrees Fahrenheit of global warming. So how do we connect the dots between global change and what it means right here in the places where we live? That's actually what I do. I do that by combining real-world data with climate model outputs and using that to calculate how our lives will be affected as the world warms by 1 or 2 degrees or more. We calculate the impacts on things that matter to us, like corn yields in Iowa under a 1 versus a 2 or 3 degree warming scenario. How often a record-breaking hot summer, like the one we saw in Texas in 2011, would recur as the world warms by 1 or 2 degrees. Or how the water supply for a city or a water district or a state would be threatened as the world warms by 2 or 4 degrees. Why do I do this? Because in order to understand why another degree of warming is such a big deal, we can't rely on our own experience of temperature. None of us has ever experienced such a big change in global average temperature, and especially not one that's happening so fast. As far back as we can go in the history of human civilization on this planet, we have never lived through such a large and a rapid change. It truly is unprecedented. And our food, our water, our energy, our infrastructure, and our economic systems are not built or prepared to cope with it. So next time someone scoffs, 2 degrees, that's nothing. Tell them, no, it is a lot. It is more than enough to tell us that our planet is running a fever. It's real, it's us, and it's not just serious. It's time to fix it before it's too late.
Thank you, Katharine Hayhoe. So a strong climate accountability act is absolutely essential to fixing this and ensuring that Canada is doing its absolute utmost to ensure that warming is limited to 1.5. Another reason Canada needs a strong Climate Accountability Act. Canada has missed every emissions reduction target it has ever set. It missed the 1992 Rio target, the 2005 Kyoto target. It's going to miss the 2020 Copenhagen target, and we are not on track to reach our commitment under the Paris Agreement. So we need a strong Climate Accountability Act to hold our government to account to legislated targets to ensure that we do not miss another one. We need a strong Climate Accountability Act that will encourage investment in the just transition. We are going to be coming out of the pandemic. We want a just recovery from the pandemic in which no one is left behind. And we want to carry this forward into the just transition to a low carbon economy. In Canada, we absolutely need a Climate Accountability Act that recognises the rights, needs, and knowledge of Indigenous people. Indigenous people across Canada are often on the front lines of the impacts of climate change. We see the melting of the permafrost in the north, damage to ecosystems in Indigenous lands across Canada. And Indigenous peoples have been absolutely at the forefront of fighting for climate action, of fighting to prevent the expansion of the fossil fuel industry over their land. So in Canada, absolutely Indigenous people must be included in any Climate Accountability Act. We need a Climate Accountability Act that will survive changes in government, that will be durable, that will establish governance structures that will carry climate action forward. Climate change planning is long-term planning. So we need this to ensure that we reach our targets all the way to the net zero 2050 target. And Canada should be joining other climate leading nations who have enacted climate accountability laws. These include the UK in 2008, Denmark in 2014, Germany, New Zealand, and other nations. Our government is talking the good talk. We want to make sure that they act and give us a strong Climate Accountability Act. And you can see here how a strong Climate Accountability Act can actually work. In 2008, the UK government enacted their Climate Change Act and proceeded with 5-year carbon budgets. And that blue line, as you can see, they have significantly reduced their emissions. They've met and exceeded their pledges to the different climate accords. Whereas Canada, on the red line with the red targets, is consistently missing our commitments. So we need to change that. What would be in a good Climate Accountability Act? So here I'm drawing on a policy brief, a new Canadian Climate Accountability Act that was developed by lawyers from EcoJustice, working with experts from the Pembina Institute, Equiterre, West Coast Environmental Law, as well as the Climate Action Network, CANRAC, here in Canada. And so these are the 5 pillars that they've identified. I've somewhat simplified them here, but this is what we absolutely want to see in a strong Climate Accountability Act. So pillar 1, long-term greenhouse gas emission reduction targets set in law for 2030 and 2050, in keeping with what the IPCC has recommended. Number 2, 5-year milestones, carbon budgets that will help us get to those long-term targets. So every 5 years, a measured amount of carbon can be emitted. This is how we will get to those long-term targets. Pillar 3, addressing the impacts of climate change. So both reporting on the impacts of climate change on communities and ecosystems, and then planning for adaptation to climate change. So this is absolutely necessary for the just transition, looking at the impacts of climate change and looking at the impacts of planning to meet those targets as well. That too has to be addressed in strong climate accountability legislation. Pillar 4, accountability, plans to meet targets and reports on progress. So our government should be required to make plans to meet the 5-year milestones and to meet the long-term targets and actually meet them. So there needs to be a clear legislated duty to meet the targets, has to be part of the strong climate accountability legislation. And then as another part of accountability to the public, regular reporting on progress. So reports on how we're doing with plans to meet the targets, reports on how we're doing with planning for adapting to climate change, and making these reports regular. This is essential for transparency and accountability and for mobilizing the public on the need for climate action. And then lastly, pillar 5, which really should be integrated into all of these pillars, is the Independent Expert Climate Advisory Committee. So this Climate Advisory Committee must be composed of scientists, experts, and Indigenous peoples from across Canada. Its role should be to advise the government and monitor progress, to consult and advise with the provinces, and to regularly inform the public. So as experts, the idea here is that this will help to depoliticize climate policy with an emphasis on the science and an emphasis on independent advice. So did we get this? What did we get? Well, we have Bill C-12, the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, was introduced. What did it deliver? So far, with the targets, yes, we got a 2050 target, net zero target legislated, but we do not have a target for 2030. And this is a serious omission that absolutely needs to be corrected. The preamble to the bill recognizes the IPCC's warning that, quote, achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 is key to keeping the rise in the global mean temperature to 1.5 Celsius. But it completely omits the full warning, which says that net emissions must decline by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030 before reaching net zero around 2050. So we absolutely need a legally binding target for 2030. This is essential to the fight for 1.5. We also really want this target to be more ambitious. Our government right now is still holding with the target from the Harper years of 30% below 2005 levels. And most climate groups are recommending that Canada double its commitment to 60% below the 2005 levels. Canada is a wealthy country. It's one of the highest emitting countries in the world, both per capita and accumulatively. We have the resources to invest in the just transition and the moral responsibility to take stronger action. So, pillar 2, how did we do? We do have 5-year milestones, but they only start in 2030. Again, action this decade. We have to have these 5-year milestones starting in 2025. That's just an absolute. These 5-year milestones are being set 5 years in advance. We need them to be set 10 years in advance. This is necessary for planning. It's necessary for committing future governments to ongoing planning for emission reductions. And then really importantly, these 5-year milestones in the legislation as currently drafted are emission reduction targets. We need them to be carbon budgets. And this next slide shows us why. So you can see here 2 pathways. One is focused on emission reduction targets, and one is focused on carbon budgets. The problem with emission reduction targets is you can actually have so many more emissions emitted. And one way of thinking of this, as I was trying to think of an analogy, is with a bathtub. So emission reduction targets would be focusing on the flow of the water. So you want to make sure your bath doesn't overflow. You say, okay, great, I'm committed to reducing the flow to 50% by 2030. So, you know, the water's going away, you cut down the flow at 2030 to half of that, but it keeps flowing. And then at 2050, you turn it off. But at this point, the bathtub is completely overflowed. What we need are budgets for the water or carbon. So we've got a clear idea of how much carbon can possibly go into the atmosphere if we're to keep warming to under 1.5, and we budget that carbon. So every 5 years, this is clear, measurable amount of carbon, which provides much better for planning and is a much firmer commitment if we are to reach this, keeping global warming to under 1.5. Impacts. The bill as currently drafted does not address climate change impacts at all. So this is, again, something that needs to change. We need the bill to address the impacts of climate change on communities and ecosystems across Canada. We need it to address the impacts of transitioning to a low carbon economy. So that absolutely has to be included. New Zealand does a much better job of this. We should be following their example and really thinking of how this transition to a low carbon economy really does leave no one behind. And that involves looking at impact. So that's something else we need to see changed. Pillar 4, accountability, plans to meet budgets and reports on progress. So in the bill as currently drafted, the Minister for the Environment is required to make plans to meet the targets, but if the government fails to meet the target, the Minister is only required to explain why and describe the actions the government is taking or will take to meet it. So the only thing deterring the government from setting weak targets and implementing relatively weak plans is public pressure. This is insufficient. The legislation must be amended to impose a clear duty on the Minister to meet the milestone budgets and to meet the long-term targets. Eco-justice lawyers have recommended that this take the form of an explicit statement that the mandatory obligations of the Act are enforceable in a court of law. So the accountability mechanism here has to be so much stronger. And then reporting. Another part of accountability. Currently, the Minister is required to produce reports on progress every 5 years. We have to make these annual, otherwise the public will not understand. If you have public pressure as your only means of making ministers meet targets, getting the government to meet the targets, how is that public pressure going to be mobilized if people don't even know about these climate action plans? So we need reporting to be annual. We need the government to be reporting annually on its greenhouse gas emission reductions and annually on progress in the plans to meet these targets. So another area for amending. And then, right. The independent advisory body. Here we have an advisory body who is to advise the Minister, and separately we have the Commissioner for Environment and Sustainable Development to do reporting on progress every 5 years. We need the independent advisory committee to be strengthened. First of all, right now, there's nothing in the legislation about who will be serving on this committee, which leaves it open to political influence. It needs to be specified. The qualifications of those who serve on this committee absolutely need to be specified. So we want to make sure it includes scientists. It has to include Indigenous representation. We want experts from different economic sectors across Canada. Then there's this question of fossil fuel executives, and many would argue that we should be making sure that anyone who has been involved in denying climate change or delaying action on climate change should be excluded, and that this might well need and require the exclusion of fossil fuel executives. And we, in order to strengthen the role of the Independent Advisory Committee, the recommendation is that it too does the job of independent reporting and monitoring. So rather than this being done by the commissioner within the government, in some ways having the government reporting on itself, we have the reporting and monitoring being undertaken at arm's length by this non-partisan body. So that would really strengthen this climate accountability legislation if we got the recommendations about the work of the advisory body changed to fit these recommendations. And lastly, there is this additional issue of intergovernmental cooperation, which a few people have raised as a real problem in the Canadian context. And so this is something which could be improved if the legislation really did something to address institutionalizing collaboration between federal, provincial, territorial, municipal, and Indigenous governments. One way of doing that would be further specifying that this work of getting government getting subnational governments together be part of the work of the advisory body, that they should be consulting and advising the subnational governments in order to ensure collaboration across Canada. So we have our work cut out for us on how to amend this climate accountability legislation and make it stronger. And we have to get to work in order to ensure we get legislation that will keep us at 1.5. Thanks very much.